Hi guys, welcome to my second episode featuring the Atari 2600, and today we're going to be taking a look at the worst game ever made, a game that single-handedly crashed the entire video game industry worldwide. Only that's actually not true at all. Today we're going to be doing a review of E.T. for the Atari 2600. So before I get into the actual review, let's get one thing straight. E.T. did not single-handedly destroy Atari, did not single-handedly cause a video game crash of 1983. Atari was already doomed and would have crashed already in 83 or 84 with or without E.T. E.T. was just one of their biggest and most high-profile failures. And on top of that, the circumstances surrounding the failure of E.T., really what was behind its actual failure of that game specifically, were the exact things that were affecting the entire program at Atari. E.T. was just this perfect figurehead of everything that went wrong in Atari, solidified in a very black and white figurehead answer. And on top of that, the video game industry in 83, calling it a crash of the entire industry is a little exaggerated, it's a little dramatic, it's a nice story and it's an interesting part of history, but more realistically, it could be called the crash of home console video games in North America. Very specific, because at the time, even in North America, the Commodore 64 was going really strong. The Apple II was really kicking up steam and getting a lot of great games. So even after that crash, until the NES came out and brought video games back to the home console market in North America, video games as a whole didn't just kind of disappear. It was really that explosion of the home console gaming. And outside of North America, the crash of Atari was not necessarily a huge deal as far as affecting the video game industry at all. Now there's only one point left to discuss. Is E.T. the worst game ever made? Or is it even one of the worst games ever made? And one thing I'm going to make a note of here before I start the review is that I'm not going to take into account the circumstances under which E.T. was made. Because frankly, if I did that, it would already get a free pass from me and not earn the label of worst game ever made. Because the circumstances under which it was made, it's incredible that it's actually a functioning game, and it's amazing how much is actually there. But again, not going to take that into account. I'm going to just take a review of the game itself, a blind review as if I knew nothing about it, and really just look at it within the time frame of other games released around the same time. Is E.T. really the worst game ever made? So in E.T. for the Atari 2600, you have one main objective, and that is to collect all the pieces of the telephone so E.T. can phone home, and then after you've reached the area where you phone home, you have a limited amount of time to reach the spaceship and escape and go home. It's a very simple premise, but it's actually done in a fairly interesting way. The entire time you have a little meter represented by basically a block of numbers that will decrease as you walk around the map, as you try and run, as you fall down pits it decreases even further, and raise yourself back up. Everything you do decreases this meter. And you can replenish that meter by finding up to 9 Reese's Pieces throughout the world and replenishing that meter. And if you die, Elliot will actually come and save you, only a couple times before it's game over. So overall, it's a little bit more complicated than running around an empty environment and collecting these pieces and avoiding foes. You actually have to also consider your movements as almost like a time limit, but more of a movement limit, and strategize in finding pieces of the Reese's Pieces to refill that. At the same time, an FBI agent will chase you around the map and try and take you back to his holding cell, which you immediately escape, and it's all about moving around this world, avoiding people that are trying to capture you, at the same time trying to collect all these pieces, and do it with all within a time frame where you're not using up all of your energy and dying before you can complete the telephone and phone home. So already there's a little bit of complexity involved, and what makes it even better is that the entire world is actually comprised of a cube. 6 sides that form this whole world, 6 different environments that come together to create one of the first attempts on the 2600 to create a little bit more of a unified world, a unified environment, instead of something that's a straight left or right or up or down movement. It feels a little bit more like a free-roaming experience, which is in itself makes it more complex and more interesting than many other releases for the system. So again, in that point just by itself, it's not the worst game on the system by a design perspective, with one exception. Constantly throughout this game, while you're being chased and moving throughout the environment, you'll be falling down pits. first time I put this game in, it took me 3 seconds before I fell down a pit and had to raise E.T.'s neck and have him levitate out of the pit. And this to me is one of the fatal flaws in the gameplay. If it weren't for the pits, it actually might be a semi-interesting and semi-decent game that would already stay out of that drop of the worst game ever made. The pits really hurt it though. They are far too frequent, they are frustrating and annoying, they don't really add anything to the gameplay, they don't really add any difficulty, they just are a nuisance. And on top of that, they're the one element in the game that to me doesn't represent the license at all. I feel like it would have been serviced better if there was some way to, say, summon Elliot and escape on his bicycle away from the FBI agents, or something in general that reminded me more of the feeling of the film. The whole idea behind this game, to me, could be something that's not E.T. Just change the sprite and the name and the cover art to something entirely different, and it already works and makes sense on its own. A good usage of a license really reminds you of the thing it's based on. And aside from the art, it really doesn't remind me of E.T. That to me is one thing that really stood out compared to some other games that I've played that are licensed games. It didn't really remind me of the license, and that in itself already kind of makes it a bad game. But from a gameplay perspective, it's really, I've played worse games. It's not the worst game ever made by far. Is it a bad game? Absolutely, but I have played worse. In the sound department, you do get a little bit of the theme song and it sounds pretty good. None of the sounds are very ear-piercing and annoying, which sometimes can happen with 2600 games where they try something creative and it just sounds like noise. It's really not bad in the sound department. It's another area where the game is underrated, I feel. Again, it falls into that category of kind of in the middle of the pack. Nothing amazing, but it really is not that bad in that sound area. Visually, it's not terrible either. All the characters are recognizable, you can tell what things are supposed to be, although overall the game is fairly uninteresting and doesn't really have a great artistic flair. It's not very colorful, something about it just seems a little bland, and again, doesn't really remind me too much of the license. One thing to its credit, however, is it actually has a pretty decent title screen, which is fairly rare amongst 2600 games to have an actual nice looking title screen, and that is the one area that really did impress me and reminded me of the license that it's based off of. So that is another point in favor of this game. Visually, it actually has a few things that are somewhat impressive, although the overall look of the game is fairly bland. It really, again, is not terrible. Overall, E.T. gets a bad rap. I think it became sort of an internet meme where a lot of people who have never even experienced the game are calling it the worst game of all time just because they've been told that. Or many people going and playing it for the first time, whether on an actual system or through emulation. If you go in thinking something is guaranteed to be the worst game ever played, you probably will go in thinking it's the worst game ever played and really have a bad time. And particularly when there are elements of the game that are genuinely bad, it's going to add to that feeling, and you're just going to go in looking at it through this lens of, alright, this is horrible, now let's just determine how horrible. You have to approach it by thinking about, okay, how is this game? Don't go in thinking it's going to be great, don't go in thinking it's bad, and overall it's a fairly average 2600 game. It's really not horrible, it's not great, but to me, as from the games that I've played, around 40 games for the system, I would actually probably place it somewhere right in the middle, somewhere in the 20s. It is definitely not the worst game ever made. It's not even the worst game on the Atari 2600. It's a bad game, but again, title of the worst game ever made, not even close.